Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I am Teresa Hanley. I'm the project director for the Toward Peace project of the Mission Inn Foundation. So I'd like to say hello and welcome everyone to our presentation, first presentation of Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War. Over the next 6 weeks, we will hear from a series of historians concerning the history of the Mission Inn and its founder, Frank A. Miller, and his peace activism in the years surrounding World War I, both local history and the fuller and national and international contexts of Miller's activities. This speaker series is a featured element of our project Toward Peace, which explores Miller's activism and its legacy for us today, both as individuals and as a community. We are very proud that Toward Peace is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org, calhum.org, to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Oth, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, just a bit of Zoom housekeeping. We have muted audience microphones and disabled audience cameras to enhance the quality of reception for everyone. We have also disabled the chat feature tonight for similar reasons. You can still ask questions, so please do. You can post your questions in the Q&A down at the wherever your taskbar is on your Zoom screen. You can post those during the presentation and Jennifer will address them following her talk. If you have technical issues, please post those in the Q&A as well. Our executive director, Jared Hoagland, is our tech manager tonight, and he and I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation. One of us will respond if you have any tech questions. So now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Keene, Professor and Dean of Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Chapman University. Dr. Keene is a specialist on the American experience in the World War I era, having written several books and numerous articles, including Doughboys, the Great War, and the Remaking of America. With Michael Nyberg, she co-edited Finding Common Ground, New Directions in First World War Studies. She has served as consultant on numerous exhibitions and documentaries and as an associate editor of the Journal of First World War Studies. Her presentation for us tonight sets the stage for our future sessions. She has titled it, Why the First World War Still Matters to America. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Jennifer Keene.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And it's really nice to be here giving the presentation. As some of you may or may not know, we were supposed to be doing this a year ago. And then of course, our whole life changed and it wasn't sure if it was going to happen. And now here we are, very experienced in a complete new form of lecture delivery and participation, and able to talk about the First World War once again and its ongoing significance for American society. So, as Teresa mentioned, my talk is really laying the groundwork for the specific themes that'll be discussed in subsequent sessions. And I think in part it's a great session to have because unlike other conflicts, World War I does not have a really resounding touchstone memory in American society. Well, a lot of people are unsure really happened, the scope of American participation, the really fundamental way that it transformed American society, and even how many of those transformations continue to resonate today. So that's really the goal of my presentation. It's an overview. It's kind of a bird's eye view of the American experience in the war, and I'll look forward to some questions at the end. So now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint, and that'll sort of help as we're walking through. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, here we go. All right. So I think what's really important right from the beginning is to be thinking about the sort of basic chronology of America coming into the war. And as again, probably many of you know, the United States does not enter the war until April of 1917, even though the war had begun in Europe of August 1914. This doesn't mean that America was uninvolved in the conflict during that so-called period of neutrality. In fact, we were quite instrumental in numerous ways, first through munitions trade, through financing of the Allied powers, through volunteers going to France, through humanitarian aid efforts to help civilians who were displaced by the war. But we were not an active belligerent. And that was going to change in April of 1917 when Woodrow Wilson went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war, and made an historic decision that this was, in fact, going to be America's conflict to fight. And so we're really going to pick up the story there, but I will say that we could also talk quite a lot about the first 2.5 years of so-called neutrality in terms of how that also really impacted the United States, both during the period of active belligerency and subsequently. So when Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war, he gave a speech that is sometimes overlooked, except for a few key phrases of what he said. It's an important speech because in it he outlined what he felt were the aggressions that Germany had undertaken against the United States, especially its threatening of American trade through its resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, that were threats to American national security. So he painted the war in the first iteration as a war of self-defense, that this was necessary to prevent Germany from really limiting American freedoms to trade and move throughout the world as it wished. But he could have stopped there, quite honestly. That probably would have been enough for the American people. But instead, he went much further, and he outlined a vision of American responsibility in the world and American responsibility in the war that went beyond simply defending itself and defending its peoples. And these are probably phrases that we've become quite familiar with, and I've lifted some of the really important sentences from his war address, where he talks about the fact of fighting for the ultimate peace of the world and the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations great and small and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. And then, of course, the really famous phrase, the world must be made safe for democracy. And these are phrases that really set out an ideological purpose for the war that as I said, it extends beyond the notion of America simply defending itself. It really makes the war a mission of reform and a mission to spread American doctrine, American principles to primarily Europe, to help democracy thrive. And as democracy thrives, so will peace. And this becomes a notion of a new liberal international order that needs to be created in order to prevent these types of conflicts from ever occurring again. And Wilson is giving America really a leadership role in trying to ensure that this happens. And so these phrases are going to mean many things to many people. And part of the disagreements that we're going to see in the war period and afterwards come from how these ideas are interpreted. But I would argue that in this speech, we do also see the very first obvious way that the First World War continues to influence us. And it's in the notion that these principles, we have not abandoned them. We still, in many ways, adhere to these ideals whenever we are engaged in conflict overseas, or even in the way that we conduct our global business. So these really, in a sense, lay out a sort of blueprint for and a blueprint for what we want to achieve, and also a blueprint for controversy over how we do it or if we should do it, that resonates even today. Now, a few months later, in January of 1918, Wilson issues his 14 points. And in this, it's another version of these principles that he had really introduced in a very abstracted way in his war address. And in the 14 points, he actually puts some specificity to them. And so I've just listed a few of the really critical ones that, again, these are 14 points. We're not going to go through all 14, but you can see here where he begins to really frame some specific goals of what he believes constitutes a blueprint for a democratic Europe and also for a peaceful world. Now, I put these principles sort of very intentionally in the center of your screen because on either side of them, you see images of what Wilson feared. And when he began the war for the United States, the fear was Germany and the Kaiser and the idea of autocratic monarchies continuing to rule in Europe and through their imperial outreach, gradually taking over the world. But by January of 1918, that was not the only threat to democracy or challenge to spreading democracy in the world, because in the interim, the Second Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Russian Revolution, had occurred. And over here on the right-hand side of the screen, you see Lenin, who had taken power in Russia in November of 1917, sweeping out the old. And the sweeping out that the Bolsheviks are undertaking includes monarchies, but it also includes religion, and it also includes capitalism. And so now there's this sort of additional notion of how a world could be reformed. If you sweep away the monarchies, it's not necessarily democracy that gets put in its place. It might be Bolshevism, it might be communism. And so in this world in 1918, even Wilson's original concepts become adulterated, and there begins to begin new complexity in terms of what's going to happen now. So I like to start by really laying this out because I think we have to understand the ideological environment in which Americans are operating to see how, when questions begin arising about what this war is about, what it's intended to bring about, and how it fails, we know what people's expectations are. And at least for Wilson, these are the ones that he lays out. Whether that's shared by the bulk of the American people, well, we can talk about that. That's a different set of issues here. So in order for Wilson to have any hope of actually achieving these goals, America has to play a direct role in the war. This is his notion. And not only does it have to play a direct role in the war, but it has to be instrumental in victory. If America does not have a prominent place on the battlefield the day that the war ends, Wilson does not believe he can reasonably expect to have a prominent place at the peace table. And so this leads to the first challenge that the country as a whole will face after war is declared, which is the need to raise a mass army, to train it, officer it, transport it, and get it into position on the Western Front to make a noticeable impact or difference on the eventual, they're hoping, victory. And the reason this is going to be such a challenge for the United States is that despite the war having been being fought in Europe for nearly 2.5 years, the United States has taken very few practical preparations or steps towards creating the kind of mass army that it will need to fight effectively on the Western Front. And just to give you an example of what I mean, when the United States declares war, we have really available, and this is putting National Army and National Guard troops together, about 300,000 men. And if we fast forward 19 months ahead, we will see that the United States has under arms over 4 million men. And so the scope of expansion and the need to pull men into the service quickly and efficiently, in some ways, it's a success story for the United States. We get the numbers that we want. We get 2 million of those men in France. And so there is a sense that this works. But in April of 1917, this is the looming challenge, and the country has to figure out how is it going to raise the men that it needs. And so what the Wilson administration decides is that we're going to conscript these men, and we're going to allow some volunteering, but the primary method for bringing men into the military is going to be through conscription. And over 72% of the men who eventually are brought into the army are conscripted. And in order to do this, you have to get the public on your side, because conscription had a bad rap in American society at the time. It was seen as a way to force men into uniform, forcing men to fight an unpopular war that they did not want to fight. And it was important that the Wilson administration change that perception and also remove as many opportunities for men to avoid registering and to avoid the draft. So the first thing they did was they never called it the draft. They called it selective service, because the notion was that if you're selected for service, that's an honor, rather than seeing it as something that you're being forced to do against your will. And they also turned registration into an event that necessitated national celebration. And so this poster here, you can see this, June 5th, 1917, which is the first National Registration Day. The quote from Woodrow Wilson, "A great day of patriotic devotion and obligation." And the notion here was that on June 5th, the whole country was going to shut down. Men were going to come to their polling places and register in public. Everybody was going to watch them, and then there would be celebrations, and this would be a way that you could ensure that men in fact complied with the requirement to register for the draft. I got interested in this phenomenon a few years ago, and I did a project with my students where we actually looked at some local newspapers to see how this unfurled in actuality. And I have sort of give you a few examples here where you can see a lot of information in the local newspaper. One of these comes from San Bernardino, really close to us. And I love the cartoon that is around the masthead, because I'm going to kind of use my cursor here. You can kind of see all the men lining up. And they're so excited to register for the draft that as they get closer to handing in their draft registration cards to Uncle Sam, they're practically running, knocking each other over to register. And so there was a sense here that the press, public officials, local committees were cooperating with the federal government to make sure that people actually showed up and did what they were supposed to do. And you can see in one of these newspapers, you've actually got a long line of men, again, sort of photographic evidence that this was working in person. I will have to say, though, that one of my absolute favorite newspapers is this one. I love this headline here from the Chicago Daily Tribune, which says, "Enrolling Liberty Army, Patriots will register gladly, all others must." I think that if you need a kind of shorthand version of what happened with conscription, that really nails it for you. What this meant was that if you were not interested in registering the draft, and you were not interested in participating in this war, and you were of draft eligible age, it was going to be difficult for you to be able to do that, to avoid service. The newspapers did not just publish information, for example, about how to register or the need to register. They published lists of names, names of men who showed up, names of men who didn't show up, in names of men who had passed their physicals. In fact, when the Socialist Party was interested in sending out pamphlets to men to urge them not to actually show up when they received their induction notices, they didn't even have to try to find the names of those men in any sort of secret way. They just opened up the newspaper, and there were the names and addresses. They could mail out their pamphlets and tell men, trying to urge men not to comply with selective service. So the point here was clearly that there was a lot of peer pressure. There was a lot of self-policing in terms of communities, and a real grassroots, effort to help the federal government get the men that it needed into uniform in a timely manner. And so in this sense, this idea that everything is going to be done publicly, and your people are watching each other, and they're ensuring that there's compliance. This is occurring in communities across the nation, and it was in a sense very, very effective. And we can see this effectiveness in another realm, which are the people who started thinking about becoming conscientious objectors. And it was quite difficult to be a conscientious objector during the First World War. In the initial regulations, only a very small number of religious sects, pacifist religious sects, were actually classified as being eligible for conscientious objection status, and men who tried even then to take it found themselves still having to go into the military, serve in a non-combatant capacity, and if they refused, often being physically punished and imprisoned for it. One of the most significant figures who attempted to become a conscientious objector was a man by the name of Alvin York. This is not a picture actually of Alvin York. This is a picture of Gary Cooper, who plays Alvin York in a later film about him, which gives you an idea of just how famous Alvin York was, if the most famous movie star of your time actually plays you in a biopic. But Alvin York was somebody from Appalachia who received a draft notice. He was 29 years old. He was so very close to the cutoff age of 30, poor, practically illiterate, somebody who understood very little about world events, gets drafted, applies for exemption as a conscientious objector. His status is refused. He gets inducted, he goes into the military, and he really wrestles with his conscience all in training camp to figure out if he's going to actually comply and agree to fight. And he ends up in long theological conversations with the company commander, who eventually convinces him that Wilson's rhetoric, the promise that this will be the war to end all wars, that this is a righteous conflict on the side of good, convinces York to take up arms, and he goes to France. He fights. He becomes one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. In the First World War for his feats on the battlefield, but later writes in and talks about his continuing conflict about whether or not he had done the right thing. But it showed just that how hard and how much pressure there was on men, even those who at first declared their interest in following their religious pacifistic principles and not fighting. The dilemma of conscientious objection and the idea that it also had to be based in religious objection as opposed to principled objection. This became the fixation of a man named Roger Baldwin, who throughout the war founded something called the National American Liberties Union and tried to help conscientious objectors obtain legal counsel and help them really fight their induction. He wasn't very successful with this, and he himself ended up serving jail time when he refused to show up when he was called for a physical exam. But it was an experience that made him really wonder about what Americans' civil rights were, and especially what their civil liberties were. We think a lot about civil liberties in terms of the notions of free speech, which was an important part of this story as well. But for somebody like Baldwin, it was also a question about your civil liberties when it came to control of your person. And as you may or may not know, this idea of what are Americans' civil liberties stuck with Baldwin, and he became one of the key founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, which, as we know, is an organization that is with us still. So even this idea of that Americans have civil liberties, that they can be defined and that they need to be protected, this is something that comes out of this experience in the First World War, and in particular, the experience that America has with mass conscription. Okay. Now, having raised the army, there was another component of how the war was going to impact American society, and that is that it was not enough just to have soldiers. The home front had to be mobilized as well. So we see Uncle Sam, who is very sternly asking Americans to, telling them that I want you, turning into an Uncle Sam that also has a few things to say to civilians at home. that this was a total war. It was going to require mobilize the economy, and there was going to be a role for American civilians as well as those who wore the uniform during the war. And so here we see probably something we're familiar with from the First World War, a changed visual landscape in terms of the ways that propaganda was being manufactured and used. For the first time in American history, there was the creation of a federal propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information, that really undertook a massive, coordinated propaganda campaign that included films, speakers, posters, a whole range of ways to convince Americans to alter their behavior and their attitudes in support of the war. And I like these particular images because I feel that sometimes when we see propaganda posters and we see them in museums, we see them individually as sort of pieces of art, as if they were sort of all separate, distinct things. But when you see how Americans experience them, you realize that more was clearly considered better, and they just plastered them on every surface they could find. They were in newspapers, they were in streetcars, they were in trains. Like, you really couldn't get away from the constant visual reminders that you needed to be supporting the war. And we see this in literally the saturation of every environment. This is one of my favorite images to illustrate this point. This is a classroom. I love this classroom where you can see that even children are really being educated and instructed about the importance of supporting the war. And it had the impact it was meant to have. We saw lots of ways that Americans were being encouraged to volunteer their time and change their behavior in support of the war, food conservation efforts, the idea of knitting socks. This became an almost required activity for civilians to be participating in, and not just in the privacy of their homes, but in go to the movies, bring your knitting, and you'd be sitting in the movies and people be clicking the needles. Any public gathering you had, pretty much meetings, people would be expected to pull out those knitting needles and knit those socks. So it was not just that you were doing your bit and you could know in your conscience, in the back of your mind, that you were helping. You had to be showing people that you were helping. It was a responsibility to sort of publicly demonstrate your patriotism. And so this idea of making patriotism visible becomes really a prominent theme in terms of how the United States is mobilizing for the war. And along those lines come restrictions on your behavior, especially coming back to the theme of civil liberties on speech. And so we have two important laws that are passed in the First World War, the Espionage Act, and then an amended Espionage Act that becomes known as the Sedition Act. And over time, these acts are interpreted as really criminalizing any speech that is deemed to interfere with the raising of the armed forces or the prosecution of the war. And so this makes it very difficult for the pacifists, for the socialists, for anybody who wants to argue against America having decided to enter the war, who wants to argue against conscription, who wants to argue against Wilson's 14 points. And we see many prominent activists imprisoned under the terms of the Espionage Act for refusing to, as the Attorney General says, obey the law and keep your mouth shut. And this, of course, will become one of these open questions again, which is, what does freedom of speech mean? And believe it or not, it's only after the First World War in 1919, when some of these cases are tested in the courts and make their way up to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court actually weighs in on defining what free speech is. And up until then, this had not been an issue in terms of thinking about it as something that the Supreme Court had to actually rule upon. And so it is the First World War that really gets us down this path that we've been in ever since, which is to understand what the right to free speech actually means. Okay. Now, along the way, besides thinking about how the mobilization and the need to bring in men, material, public opinion, all in support of the war, we begin to see segments of the American population who are responding in their own ways to what the war is all about. And here we have Wilson, who has proclaimed that the war is a war to spread democracy. And as you might imagine, there are groups in American society who lift their heads up and suggest that before we start spreading democracy to the world, maybe we should think a little bit about democracy at home. And so the extent to which the war actually makes democracy more expansive or more participatory within American society during and after the First World War becomes one of the critical questions that often gets raised. Gets raised at the time, and it gets raised afterwards. So the first group that we can really examine in this respect are women. I mean, we have this idea that war times tend to be positive moments for women because these are moments when women's labor is needed in different capacities, and it leads to a sort of expansion of opportunity, a loosening of restrictions, and a sense that wars become opportunities for women to make advancements. This is a notion we have that is really, for 20th century war, really embedded in our understanding of the American wartime experience, and one that's really hard to shake. And so some of that comes around the notion of expanded economic opportunities. And here we have some images of women who go into the factories, women who have new opportunities for nursing and going overseas and serving the military during the war. And always the question we ask is, well, do these wartime opportunities translate into permanent gains afterwards? And there's not really one answer to that. In some respects, they do. We definitely think of the 1920s and a kind of loosening of gender roles, and certainly for women who were interested in professional nursing careers, experience in the military, serving overseas could translate into professional advancement when you got home. In factory jobs, not so much. Once the men came back, those jobs went back to men, and so we don't really see that as a major transformation. But probably the area where in the First World War we see a big move forward for American women is in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. We've just come off the 100th anniversary of that. And while we can't say that the First World War was solely responsible for this happening, we can say that the First World War offered new opportunities for suffragists to make a claim that the time was right to actually enact female suffrage. And this really came by, again, latching on to things that Wilson had said in his various speeches about what the war was about and what the American society needed from American women to make this war result in victory. And so these two images that I have here, both the pickets outside the White House and then this cartoon of a nurse looking at Uncle Sam who says, if you are good enough for war, you're good enough to vote. These two images really represent two different poles of the suffrage movement. On the one hand, we had a sort of moderate wing that was led by Carrie Chapman Catt that really went full on with volunteering for the American war effort. Their argument was that women were necessary to win the war. They were going to demonstrate how essential American women's sort of normally unseen labor was to the nation and to national security, and really focused on making the argument that you are asking women to assume all the responsibility of citizenship without bestowing upon them the rights of citizenship. And this was their argument in terms of demonstrating loyalty and expecting the vote as a reward for having served the country loyally during time of war. The National Women's Party, which was led by Alice Paul, took a completely different tact. They had started a brand new form of collective nonviolent action before America entered the war, a few months earlier, of picketing. Nobody had picketed the White House before. They were the first, and they refused to stop picketing after America entered the war, even though they were attacked by crowds, they were harassed, they were arrested, they were put in workhouses where they went on hunger strikes, and then they were force fed. They really literally put their bodies on the line, and they took a very different radical stance that they didn't care about the war. They cared about suffrage. They called Wilson a hypocrite for claiming he was spreading democracy when he was not willing to fight for it for American women at home, and really sought to embarrass him in terms of how his hesitancy on that issue did not show him to be truly committed to this notion of democratic change. Really, I think what we can conclude is that both of these strategies mattered in first pushing Wilson onto the side of the 19th Amendment and eventually bringing about the amendment being sent to the states and its ratification. And I would just make this point really, which I think is really important, not because the war caused the country to give women suffrage, but the war created different arguments for women to make about why female suffrage mattered. And in that sense, they were ultimately successful. Now, they were not the only ones. Oops, sorry there. African Americans also spoke up and believed that the war showed the hypocrisy of America in terms of its unwillingness to really extend democracy to all American citizens. And here the story is not as positive, because we see that while African Americans do loyally serve during the war, they are not given the same opportunities to demonstrate, for example, heroism in battle. The Army is very careful to regulate the majority of African Americans to non-combatant roles. Nearly 89% of the 400,000 men who serve will serve as non-combatants. And it's very difficult in those types of positions to receive the sort of acclaim and honor that say someone like Alvin York got, because the medals, the newspaper stories, the parades, these go to the men who are in the front lines. And so by having very few positions open for African Americans to actually fight, you limit the opportunities for them to be perceived by the larger American public in this heroic manner. In addition, the rampant racism of American society at the time led to an explosion of racial violence during the war. Some of our most horrific racial riots have occurred during the war and afterwards when Black veterans came home. We see an upsurge in lynching. This is not a moment where we can really see a lot of positive attainment. But nonetheless, it is still a very significant moment for the African-American civil rights movement. And I just want to tell you one really quick story about a particular soldier, a man by the name of Charles Ism, because I think his experience sort of encapsulates how this larger picture I was drawing of sort of increased racial violence and of lynching and of racism. It doesn't capture everything that was going on, and what it doesn't capture in particular is how African American soldiers themselves were transformed by the experience of being in the military and by the experience of serving in France, and how they came back and actually were different people who participated in the subsequent civil rights movement in different ways. And so Charles Ism is a good example of that kind of transformation, because he's drafted, he goes in, he is actually a combatant. He's one of the soldiers who fights, and he comes home and he writes a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the editor of The Crisis, which is the publication of the NAACP. And he writes about this experience that he has in France right after the war ends, where his division commander had sent out a notice saying that Black soldiers were prohibited from interacting with French white women. And if they did, they would be court-martialed. Ism is incensed by this order because he's become friendly with a white family, and that family has invited him to a wedding, and he resolves to go. He is in fact arrested by a white officer. He's brought in for his court martial, and he goes before the colonel, and the captain, and he says, the captain says, "How do you plead?" And Ism, who is a sergeant, says, "I don't plead anything because I refuse a summary court martial. I want a general court martial." And the officer looks at him and says, "This may be your right, but you are very foolish to use it." And Ism is incensed. He's incensed with the idea that somebody is telling him to not use the rights that he actually has. He refused to back down, and they go back and forth, and it's a kind of anticlimactic ending to the story because he's released, gets an honorable discharge, and the whole thing goes away. But even though he's not physically punished, he's so angry at this injustice. He writes it in a letter to Boys. He wants Du Bois to print his story in the newspaper. Du Bois doesn't print his story, but Ism doesn't give up, and Ism continues to do a whole host of things. He, for example, he comes back to California. He goes to a restaurant out in San Pedro. He's there with a light-skinned friend. The light-skinned friend gets one menu. He gets another menu with higher prices because the light-skinned friend is being perceived as white. Ism again is incensed, so he sues the restaurant and actually ends up winning the case. In another episode, that same friend, he's trying to buy a house in a white neighborhood. He can't get anybody to sell to him. The light-skinned friend buys it for him and then transfers the deed to him. So he's come home energized, and he's fighting small fights, but he is determined to fight for the rights that he actually has. So this is an example of how in an individual person, you can see the transformation that they have while they're in uniform beginning to affect subsequently what happens in their life trajectory. And you might be sitting here thinking, oh, that's very interesting, Jennifer. But this is one person, so what could this really mean in the larger scope of history? And I'm not expecting you to know who Charles Ism is, but I'll bet you know who this is. And what's the connection between Charles Ism and Jackie Robinson? Well, Jackie Robinson marries Rachel Ism, who is Charles Ism's daughter. And if you know anything about the Robinson story, you know that Rachel Ism Robinson is as much an activist as Jackie Robinson. I mean, still alive, still fighting the fight. And the point here is that when we understand the civil rights movement in the 20th century, we're understanding the long civil rights movement. And we don't get to Jackie Robinson integrating baseball without Charles Ism refusing to abide by what he perceives as an illegal order in the military, or refusing to accept higher prices on a menu just because of the color of his skin. And so these are the small actions that culminate in those big historical moments that we write in our textbooks. And the First World War is full of stories like that, full of stories of individual people who, when you start tracing out their lineage, you see what a tremendous impact they had on what we then come to call the modern civil rights movement. And so this is just another way in which we start seeing the resonance that the war has for American society in a bigger framing here. So the last sort of group or demographic that I want to talk about in terms of thinking about how the war impacts their fortunes in American society are immigrants. This is the age of massive immigration to the United States. As a result of that, there are a lot of fears about how loyal these sort of hyphenated Americans are to the United States, and also questions about will they in fact get on board with serving in the military with all the voluntary efforts that America needs in order to fight the war successfully. And you can see that in this one poster here. Are you 100% American? Prove it. Um, and these other documents here, which are the ways in which German Americans literally become the most suspect immigrant population in American society virtually overnight. If you're still have German nationality, in other words, if you're a first generation German immigrant who has not become a naturalized citizen, you are dubbed an enemy alien. You are required to register with the government. And here's a registration, an example of a registration card where you need to be photographed, fingerprinted, and you have to carry around this identification card, register with the police if you move around. I mean, you need to be tracked. And we can see in the sweep of almost 18 months, the evisceration of an entire ethnic culture that had thrived in American society. German American communities had institutions, schools, churches, newspapers, a strong German speaking foundation. All of that literally evaporates overnight with people changing their names, not speaking German. German publications cease, and that never comes back. Those are gone for good. I mean, this is a kind of aspect of American ethnic culture that literally just disappears. But for many other immigrant groups, the war is a different moment. It's a moment for people to actually leave their ethnic enclaves and and feel invited into mainstream society. The publicity is also very inclusive, and if you're not considered an enemy alien, in which people are suddenly invited to be on these patriotic committees, to join the military in large numbers, to participate in American civic life in a way that they had not previously been able to do. The foreign-born population is a significant part of the American military. Nearly 1 out of every 5 soldiers is foreign-born during the First World War. And this becomes, for many of them, an opportunity. And so I just want to talk about one particular soldier right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor here. I'm sort of pointing to him right here. So this is Wilford Despatie, and he was French Canadian. He was somebody who had been brought to the United States at 8 years old from Quebec to work in the textile mills in Moosup, Connecticut. Never really went to school, so had very poor literacy, spoke fragmented English, was destined to be a mill worker for his entire life. Joins the military he volunteers, goes to France, sort of learns about his fellow Americans in a brand new way, comes back to the United States and is able to use his honorable discharge, from the military in his petition for naturalization, and becomes an American citizen, joins the American Legion, and feels immense pride in his adopted country as a result of his military service. And this is a kind of story that we can see again and again for many immigrant soldiers who served during the war. And I always like to tell this particular story because that guy, good looking, that guy that he is there, that's my grandfather. So we all have these, many of us, I would say, have these kind of personal connections to these stories and what the war actually meant in the lives of our family. Now, all these men that I'm mentioning here, Alvin York, Charles Ism, Wilford Despatie, these were men who fought in the largest battle that Americans participated in the First World War, the Meuse-Argonne. And when we think of the things that Americans don't really understand about the war, I think one of the most egregious is that we don't understand the scope of this historic battle in American military history, which is quite factually one of the most lethal battles that Americans have ever participated in. You can see the length of the battle: 47 days, 1.2 million men participate, over 26,000 men are killed, 100,000 wounded. And this was a battle that the map just shows you here, this little fragment is where the Americans fought, but this is the ending phases of the war, in which all along the Western Front, the Allies are cooperating to have one massive coordinated attack against retreating German lines. And this is the final attack of the war that ends on November 11th with ultimate victory. And it helps us get at one of those nagging questions we always want to ask, which is, what difference did American participation in the war ultimately mean? And I think when we take into account the Muser gun, what we realize is that, first of all, the Americans participated in a very significant way in terms of the fighting of the First World War, both in the cost in human life, and also in the impact of making it possible for the Allies to launch this coordinated attack, which brought the war to a close really almost 2 years earlier than was being predicted at the time. So the expectation was not that the war was going to end in 1918. People expected the war to end 1919, 1920. This is what John J. Pershing, who was leading the American military, this is what he thought. He was expecting another 2 or 3 years of fighting. So the American participation in a coalition victory really was significant. Did America win the war single-handedly for the Allies? No. Here, I think we get a good sense of where the First World War stacks up in terms of comparisons to other wars. And again, if we think about the fact that America was only engaged in serious active fighting for 6 months, the 53,402 battle casualties is pretty horrendous. It shows that we did, in fact, suffer for having not prepared to fight, to do a lot of the learning was occurring as men were on the field, and that resulted in probably unnecessarily high casualty rates. So the war was a significant loss for many of the men who, for many of the families, who had men who fell on the battlefield. And when we think of these other deaths, well, this used to be news, but I don't think it's news anymore, that a lot of those deaths came from the 1918 pandemic, in which we had the intersection of 2 significant mortality events in world history, a very destructive world war, and still the most lethal pandemic of modern times. Still does, we haven't surpassed it yet, and hopefully we won't, now that we have our vaccines coming our way. But there's no doubt that added to the death and the suffering on both home front and battlefront in the First World War era. Now, as we kind of begin to think about the war winding down and ending, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the Versailles Peace Treaty, but I just do want to point out that if we go back to how I started with the key goals, overarching ideological goals that Wilson had laid out for the war in terms of spreading democracy and creating a world in which peace prevailed. For many people, the Versailles Peace Treaty was a disappointment, that it seemed in some respects to create just a host of new problems, and the sense of disillusionment that the war had not in fact brought about the promised changes and international liberal order that Wilson had projected, really led to a sense of disillusionment about the war, and a sense that it had been a mistake for the United States to enter. In the 1920s and the 1930s, that is a very predominant feeling. And we can also see in here a sense of ambiguity on America's part about those Wilsonian goals. We can be looking at something like collective security through a League of Nations as the way to muzzle the dog of war, or as an idealistic pipe dream that Wilson, these sort of soap bubbles that he's blowing. And the point here is that this is a debate in American society. Americans don't have one point of view about this in 1919, in 1920, or in 2021. And so this argument or this debate that we continue to have about the proper role of America in the world and the proper use that collective security organizations can have, these are conversations that begin in 1918, and they're not ended because we reject the Versailles Peace Treaty. In fact, the peace movement in the 1920s is very strong and continues to find alternative methods for enacting many parts of the Wilsonian vision. It's in fact in the 1930s that we start seeing those ideals falling apart, but again, linking to the First World War with the dissolution of the previous empires, the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and German Empire, had created weak nation states in Eastern Europe that were going to be, in a sense, seen as enticing territorial objectives for Hitler and Stalin in the late 1930s. And so other ways that we would see the world destabilized by supposed solutions to territorial problems and problems of autocracy 20 years earlier. And it's really at that moment that I'm going to conclude this notion of war clouds gathering in Europe once again in 1938, where we see that the memory of the First World War, which seems dim in our time and requires a lot of effort for us to recall, is not difficult for Americans to remember. In fact, they're fixated on it. And we see that in lots of the commemorative landscape and also the art world, which is what I'm kind of ending with here. And this painting by John Stewart Curry, I think, is Parade Tour is a really great allegory of what people believed they had experienced and wanted to avoid. And if we take a look at this painting, we can see that it's once again the men are marching off to war. And at the center of the painting, we have a young couple who's saying goodbye. The kids are excited by the pageantry and they're sort of running along, caught up in the excitement. And it's only out on the outskirts of the painting that we have two women who know the truth. And we have a mother who's lost her son in a previous conflict, grieving, and the war widow who's trying to push through the policemen and warn the men who are marching off to war about the truth of what awaits them. And if we zero in on the faces of the men who are marching, we see that they are turning into corpses before our very eyes. They are already the dead. And I think that this painting in some ways really illustrates to us an impact that the First World War had that directly affected how we responded to the next conflict in Europe. And I'll end by just reminding everyone that the war in Europe begins in 1939. And just like in the First World War, America waits for 2.5 years before it enters the conflict, hesitates, does not feel that this is this war to fight. And it's the memory of the First World War that leads to a lot of the hesitancy in terms of thinking about, is peace really possible through war? And that might be something worth contemplating in our age as well. So thank you very much. Hope you were able to bear with me through all of that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have any questions.
So this is Teresa back, and thank you very much. That was everything that we hoped it could be in terms of giving us our very needed background on the history of World War I for our look at Frank Miller's peace activism. We do have a couple of questions, and I see some more might be coming in. So if you do have questions that you haven't posted yet in the Q&A, please do that, and I'll be keeping an eye on those. So the first question that we have comes from Walter Parks, and he wants to know, how important was the U.S. punitive expedition into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa to preparing the country for entering war in Europe?
Yeah, so this was really important. So just for those of you who don't know, so this was in 1916 when basically the United States intervenes in the Mexican Revolution, and Pancho Villa, who's leading one of the rebel factors, crosses into the United States, murders some American citizens, and then we send a punitive expedition that is led by John J. Pershing 300 miles into Mexico to try to catch him. It's not successful, but it requires a mobilization of the National Guard to help protect the border, and then also gives really commanders like Pershing sort of their first in the field maneuvers in an active operation that sort of close to modern times. So what it really does is, first of all, it brings Pershing to public notice, which matters because he goes on to lead the American Expeditionary Force. It also matters because it points to some really key deficiencies in federalizing the National Guard, and the National Guard becomes an important source of troops. So we have a new Defense Act that's passed to try to improve coordination, federal control of those troops, overseeing their training. So we see some important legacies there. We see some important legacies in terms of equipment shortages, and so that is seen as a kind of, it's not really a test run for France because of course it's very different in terms of an actual military operation, but it does point out deficiencies that in terms of whatever preparations we do make, that helps us start to make those. And it allows those preparations to be made as defenses. Now, because one of the things, again, because you're going to be talking so much about the peace movement, is the peace movement before the wars, any preparations for war was seen as, and I mean, any strengthening of the military was seen as a preparation to fight the war in Europe. And this way it could be argued, no, look, Pancho Villa attacked us. So these measures are defensive measures that we need to undertake.
Thank you. Jennifer Kolb asks, is there documentation of African Americans in mostly non-combative military roles in other wars besides World War I?
You mean in terms of the majority of positions where African Americans are serving? So yes, so in World War II, it's the same. The majority of African Americans will be put in non-combatant roles. And it's not true in Vietnam. It's not true in the Civil War. It's a little more complicated because it depends who you're talking about. In the Civil War, obviously, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the important things that it does is it allows the Union Army to actually raise combatant units. It also is these are wars that show the different occupational structure of the military. In the Civil War, 90% of soldiers who serve are considered combatants. They fight. The labor part of logistics is mostly handled by civilian camp followers, contractors who follow the military. In the First World War, we start seeing a shift in the occupational structure of the military. It's a much larger logistical bureaucratic organization, and only 40% of positions are classified as combatants. So 60% of personnel who serve in either support or specialist units. And that trends, ding downward of the percentage of the force that is actually combatant, continues to the present day, where I think it's down to something like 12%. So in that sense, the idea that more African Americans are serving in non-combatant positions in the world wars, follows the changing occupational structure. But of course, it's the disproportional way in which they're funneled into these positions. I would tell you very intentionally, because there's fears in both wars that when you train Black men to fight, what are they going to do with those guns when they get home? If you give them medals and honor them, are you giving these men ideas, again, outside of their prescribed role in American society? So there's a sense that you're withholding the ability to attain honor through valorous combatant service very, very intentionally. So I'm going to try not to give such long answers to every single question. These are interesting questions.
So everybody's loving it, and we did have a question that has disappeared. Maybe the person who asked it has left or Googled the answer themselves. But
My
but
answer
I'm
would be
going to
better than
repeat
Google.
it just in case anybody remember or anybody else is interested. And what they were asking was if you could give the name and artist on that last painting again.
Yeah, so it's John Stewart Curry.
Okay, and I was wondering, it is a painting. It's not like
Yes.
a mural.
It's a painting. Yeah, it's a painting. Yeah.
So Sarah Allison asks, you talked about propaganda with the posters and the need to show your patriotism in public. The painting at the end is really wonderful, and I was wondering how the idea of patriotism changed after the war.
Yeah, so I think that patriotism became, there became a lot of cynicism about that. I think that people became very cynical about the notion that their loyalty and their patriotic fervor they'd been manipulated. You see, when you think of the Lost Generation literature, for example, and the way that it sort of satirizes patriotic sentiment, and you can think about the ways in which the non-interventionists in the 1930s, which is a very prominent segment of the American population, argues, remember the last time all the promises were made to you and how you were lied to, that propaganda being equated with lies that the government tells, this sort of comes from the First World War era. But it wasn't uniform. And that's probably the point I'd like to make too. There were many people who were proud of their service in the First World War. The American Legion is formed in 1919, and obviously Forgotten Country, really embraces that ethos and, engages in a lot of Flag Day celebrations, Boy Scouts, American Legion baseball, ways in which they are really continuing to valorize patriotic devotion. So it's the 1920s version of the culture wars that I never want to say there's one uniform response that people have, but it does make people much more suspicious about government propaganda. And if you look at World War II propaganda in the US compared to World War I, you can see changes. There's differences in it because of the way in which they were concerned that it had been overdone. But I'll also just say this, sorry, I'm giving another long answer. When you know who really learned lessons from the propaganda in World War I, it was the advertising industry. And a lot of major executives, Edward Bernays, the founder of public relations in the 1920s, he worked for the Committee on Public Information. So a lot of people got their start and they learned, hey, if we can sell a war that most people don't want to fight, I think we can sell toothpaste. And so you start seeing really the rise of advertising in the 1920s, and a lot of the techniques and the use of graphic design, this was experience people got in the First World War, and of course just carried it over into selling different products.
Okay, so we have a couple of others and then a comment that I want to share with everybody. So Rose Monhay asks, how did the earlier pandemic of 1918 play a role in recruitment?
Well, the way that the pandemic, I'm sorry I skipped through that sort of rather quickly here. Because we had the three waves in the 1918 pandemic, where there was the first wave in the spring and then a much more serious wave in the fall of 1918. And that wave in the fall of 1918 really coincided with the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So at the moment that you have the greatest death occurring in the military overseas, you have the greatest death occurring in the United States because of the pandemic. And then the third wave was in 1919. Of course, the war was over by then. So in terms of recruiting, they did have to slow it down, and they did suspend it for a few weeks in October when, because the influenza was just kind of, rampaging through the training camps. And so it did actually interfere for a short time with the draft. But by that point, most of the men, who were going to take part in the actual fighting were already overseas, so it didn't really change there. But the death rate within the military was significant, and one of the things about influenza, again, when you look at the death rate, that tells you one thing. But if you read some of the accounts of people who had influenza, in some ways, it's like people who've had really bad cases of COVID but have recovered. I mean, people took months to recover from the flu. This was not like our flu, where like you feel like you're knocked out for a week and you feel kind of cruddy, and then you're kind of tired for another week, but then you're okay. Like people, if they survived a bad case of the flu, literally took months to recover. So this, I think, is another way that the military was impacted, because it, at the exact moment that all these battlefield casualties are flooding into the hospitals, they're also dealing with all these flu victims and highly contagious flu victims. And so again, just to get a better sense of what the suffering really was from the illness, I think that gives you a sense too of how it impacted the military. I'm sorry, I'm going to say one more thing. There's one theory out there that one of the reasons why the Allies were so successful in 1918 in defeating the Germans is because the German soldiers were suffering more from the flu than the Allied side was. And so besides the fact that, you know, they were suffering manpower losses and you know, and there was kind of, you know, some unrest at home that was showing less support, that literally in the field, the German army was weakened because the flu was ravaging their ranks worse than the Allied side. So how it actually impacts the outcome of the war, I think, is another question that scholars debate.
Okay. So we have one kind of political question, and then I want to share this piece that someone has shared, local history related, and then I think we'll call it a night. So Cortland Gendra says, thanks for the talk as always, Jennifer. Would you say—
Hey, Cortland. I think I know Sarah Ellison too.
Yeah,
I feel like I know some of these names. She's a former student of mine.
She's my daughter too. Actually,
I was about to say, wait a minute, I feel like I know that name.
So back to Cortland's question.
Hey,
would you say the GOP was more against Versailles because Wilson did not include any prominent Republicans in the delegation, or do you think that would have mattered?
I don't think that's the reason. I mean, I think that, yeah, sometimes people say that. I think there was a philosophical difference between, say, someone like Herbert Lodge and Wilson, in terms of what America's role should be, and also what the post-World War should look like. I think that it wasn't. Obviously, there were many Republicans that couldn't stand Woodrow Wilson, and the idea that he negotiated the treaty in such a partisan manner could be one of it. But, you know, Wilson came home in the middle of the peace negotiations, and he came home and he actually presented different pieces of it. And he did listen to some Republican criticism of the treaty, especially when it came to the feeling that there were not enough protections for the Monroe Doctrine. And he went back and he actually got those objections, you know, into the treaty. So it wasn't that he was completely blind to what Republicans were saying or what he thought was going to be politically necessary to get the treaty ratified. So I think there was just a philosophical disagreement. And then also Wilson's stroke didn't help. I mean, once in the treaty fight, Wilson was gone and not able to use his own personal rhetorical skills to be able to really sway opinion. And he seemingly lost his ability to compromise. We see, you know, obviously we know what happens, but there's never one easy explanation like that for anything. It's a good, yeah, those are good answers in AP exams, but I think that in reality, the answer is more complicated than that.
Okay. So Douglas Reese sends this information for everybody, and I think this will be a good way for us to wrap up. And he says, the woman in the recruiting poster that says, "Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy," is the mother of Robert Dyer, who taught theater and acted in town, I guess that means Riverside, for many years. She was one of the first 5 women recruited by the Navy ever and served as a motorcycle messenger.
Cool.
So
good local history connection.
I know.
Yay.
Yay. And I would just like to say that I'm always thrilled when we have a speaker who enjoys his or her topic as much as you clearly do, even though there are some bits of your topic that aren't so much happy history. But I don't think we could have chosen a better person to set off our series for Riverside and the world. So thank you very much. And I don't know that you'll be able to hear us, but let's all give Professor Keene virtual applause, thanking her for being with us. And I hope that you will all join us next week. I will be talking about the specific cases of Frank Miller and some women peace activists that he knew and interacted with. And Mona Siegel will be paired with me, and she will take a look at 3 of those women in their broader national and international context. So we will absolutely be looking at Riverside and the world next week. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.